Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of the WuMao Show, where I share with you what it is like to live and work in China. Although today we're going to be talking about the neighboring countries of China and all the turmoil that we have experienced for the last few years. I am honored to be joined by Angelo Giuliano from Switzerland, and Brian Berletic from the New Atlas YouTube channel. Gentlemen, good evening. Angelo, how are you? Good morning to you.
Hi, Fernando. Great. I'm here right now in Switzerland, so it's great to be on your show.
Thank you. Great honor. And Brian, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity.
No, I really appreciate both of you accepting the invitation to do this show. It's the first time that I have you guys in the show, and I reached out to you because I know that you guys have a lot of experience and a lot of insight into what we want to discuss today. We need to begin today's show by talking about what has taken place only a couple of days ago. Afghanistan being basically taken over by the Taliban. They have entered the capital, and the president has left the country already. That is a huge change in the region, and there's a lot of speculation as to what is going to be the future of Afghanistan and relationship of all the countries around Afghanistan. The other thing that has taken place is the president of Malaysia has actually stepped down as well. So a lot of things taken place in the last few days and in the last couple of hours. So any comments on this very, very fresh news, Brian or Angelo?
Brian, if you understand.
Okay, so actually, if I can share my screen here for just a minute, I think it's really interesting. Malaysia and Afghanistan, as you can see, I mean, China is a very big country, and these are all countries that surround China. And these are all very important countries to China, especially people who are familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you look here at Malaysia, actually, there was a Belt and Road Initiative project going from Kunming through Laos, through Thailand to Malaysia and Singapore. And so the U.S. is determined to stop this. So there's destabilization in all of these countries. Afghanistan, people might not realize that, but you could see a little tiny bit of the border right there is on China's border with Xinjiang. So I mean, if the U.S. makes no secret that they want to, stop China from surpassing them, and this is their plan to do it. It's just by encircling them, destabilizing their partners, putting in client regimes that are hostile towards China. And this is a very long-running policy the U.S. has had. This is not something that started with Obama's pivot to Asia. This goes all the way back to post-World War II. We have documented evidence of this. As a matter of fact, one last thing, and then we maybe Angelo can add on to this. This is dated 1965. This is from the Office of the Historian from the U.S. State Department. It's a .gov website. And they talk about how the continued war in Vietnam only makes sense if it's in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And then down here, they talk about the fronts this containment policy is being waged on. And they talk about the Japan-Korea front, the India-Pakistan front, and the Southeast Asia front. And we see this continuing all the way to today. So this was in 1965. And even then, they're calling it the long-running campaign to encircle and contain China.
Wow. Angelo, why don't we go to you and your opinion on what is taking place around China and all these different attempts to stop the BRI. As we saw there, this project to connect China to Malaysia is being disrupted in all these tiny countries that actually the project goes through. Would you like to elaborate on some of the points that we talked about?
Yes, I think there's an interesting video on YouTube where you have a U.S. representative of an agency called IRI that actually says that they've been funding the opposition back then, And after 20 years of funding the oppositions, that opposition won. And the first thing they did was to stop a Belt and Road Initiative project. And that's the satisfaction he has. Just he's saying clearly that Malaysia will never be a U.S. ally, completely a U.S. ally, but at least they can disrupt. So it's either in the case of Myanmar, for example, they didn't manage to hijack the democracy in Myanmar. So what did they do? They just aiming for destruction, complete destruction. And they know that by destroying Myanmar, there are going to be refugees in China, and it's just affecting China directly, because 30% of the trade of Myanmar is with China.
There are very important things to consider when we analyze all these countries, is that many of them are actually not democracies. So they have governments that are not necessarily aligned with America freely or easily. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to carve out this region so as to divide people into, okay, you are with the USA, you are with the West, or you are with China. Kind of like a Warsaw Pact of 1995, where they're trying to separate the countries into, you're with us or you're against us. America has said it in the past. Now, the important thing about that is this has been going on for many years, for decades, in which these countries, they try to juggle the situation that they're in. So either they're going to hedge their position, or they're trying to balance the situation between China and America, or they're going to bandwagon and they're going to align with one or the other. This is something that is, the temperature is increasing, and people are going to have to, countries and governments are going to have to make decisions based on these three options. How do you see this developing in Thailand, Brian? Take us a little bit back to what you were experiencing down there.
In Thailand, again, they have the high-speed rail project. It's actually already under construction. So the joint Thai-Chinese high-speed rail, the leg going through Laos, which is Thailand's neighbor to the north, where the line will pass through and go to Kuoming, that is ready to open either at the end of this year or early next year. So this is how far along it is. And so what is going on in Thailand? The current government, people don't realize this. They think back to the Cold War and the Vietnam War, and they say, well, didn't Thailand host the US military during the Vietnam War? And it's true, they did, but they really had no choice. It was either that or join Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos and just get bombed and have millions of people die. So they kind of tentatively accepted that and agreed to that. But ever since then, they've been trying to repair their relationship, not only with Vietnam, but with China. And this is a process that to today has led to China being Thailand's #1 trade partner, Thailand's #1 investor. More tourists come from China to Thailand than from all Western countries combined. A lot of Western tourists here think that Thailand depends almost solely on their tourist dollars. It's not true. And Thailand is replacing a lot of their old US military equipment with brand new Chinese systems, and not small items either. Main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, naval vessels. So this is a major shift for Thailand. I just want to, let's see if I can bring this up here and share this, because I think this tells a lot. So maybe if you share my screen. This is called the Atlas of Economic Complexity by Harvard University. This shows Thailand's exports and imports by partner from the year 1998. There's a timeline here. I'm going to show you how it used to be and how it is now. So where is China? China is here. It's such a small percentage, and the United States has such a large percentage. If we fast forward to, say, 2018, it's completely inverted. You could see that. And now we have to add in Hong Kong, because the integration between Hong Kong and China is more or less complete. So you just add those together, and then just look at all of Asia compared to all of North America and Europe combined, and you can see where this trend is heading. And so Thailand today it's not a right-wing fascist government working for the US. It's not. It has pivoted. It's just the natural progression of Asia, the rise of Asia together with China. And this is what the US is trying to stop. So when we see these so-called pro-democracy protests in the streets of Thailand, they're not pro-democracy. They don't want democracy. They're not interested in human rights. This is to destabilize the country, to either destabilize it so that it cannot do business with China, or get a regime into power that is hostile towards China. And the leader of these protests, the billionaire opposition leader trying to get into power amongst these protests, his name is Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit, and he actually traveled to the United States before the 2019 Thai general elections, and he met with people in the US State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy affiliate Freedom House. He also went to Nevada to tour the Hyperloop. I don't know if people are familiar with Hyperloop. It is it's like a vacuum tube that a little tiny sled goes through that carries passengers. And they're imagining that this will be an alternative for high-speed rail, but right now it's just a concept. They have a 500-meter test track, and that's it. It hasn't moved a single passenger anywhere, and it won't for many years to come. But when he came back to Thailand, he said we should cancel the Thai-Chinese high-speed rail line and replace it with Hyperloop. So this is what the US is playing at. They're trying to get people like this into power who have alternatives that don't exist, that will freeze the region in terms of economic development. And this is how the US imagines it'll maintain primacy over the region. They openly say they want primacy over the Indo-Pacific region. And that's how you do it. When you have a smaller population, soon to have a smaller economy, the way you keep on top is by keeping everyone else down below you. So that's what they're doing. That's the whole Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, you name it, that is what they're doing. They're stifling development in all of these regions. Exactly.
They're trying to create independence movements or freedom movements or democracy movements out of nowhere, just injecting money into these societies. Angelo, if you would like to comment, what was your experience, for example, in Hong Kong, or what do you see in other countries surrounding China? I know that you guys had some exchanges talking about Tibet and the history of Tibet. So what would you like to share with us?
Well, first of all, they're going around to meddle, US is going around to meddle in other countries' affairs, using the marketing of freedom, human rights, and democracy. Well, in reality, it's, define democracy. Democracy is a process of self-determination. And there are some preconditions to have a democracy. So we need to look at our own democracy first before trying to export a model that is actually not working in the West in many instances, especially when it comes to the US. So preconditions for democracy, you need to, you shouldn't have any foreign interference. You shouldn't have any money interference, because when you have money interference, you got the elites that rule the show. You should have a certain level of maturity of people. You know, people need to understand what it means to have a democracy, respect each other's differences, and so on. You need to have unbiased media. If you have the elites that control the media, it's not a democracy. You shouldn't have mob rule. Mob rule, what is it? It's when you have 51% of a majority which is ruling over the rest, and at the expenses of the minorities. So you should have no violence, a country which is at peace. They want some countries to have a democracy when they are being attacked internally. Well, the case of Myanmar is, there's a civil war in Myanmar. How can you have a democracy when you are at civil war? And then ultimately, a constitution written by the people. And those constitutions should protect the people from the elites. So you see a lot of Western countries, they're trying to to lecture the rest of the world about their democracy when there are failures. Many are failures. There are a few examples that are interesting, like in Switzerland, but they have the preconditions for that, and those models cannot be exported. I think with Brian, we think that each country should decide for their own model, and only a Chinese can be objective about his own system. And I think ultimately, what defines the legitimacy of a system is the support that people have for that system. It's not a one person, one vote. If the rules are rigged, it doesn't work. So in the case of China, well, there's a survey by Howard University that says that 95% of the people support the system. So it's not me as a foreigner to tell Chinese what is good for Chinese. It's Chinese to decide what is good for them, because there are many elements that I would not be objective to judge when it comes to China. So then coming back to our topic about the encirclement of China, well, that started a long time ago. Remember, the first attempt to topple the system was already in 1989. The US were deeply involved in Tiananmen Square. Voice of America was the main propaganda tool that was present on the ground. And you had also, and then also the seeds were planted in Xinjiang in 1970. Before even Nixon met with Mao Zedong, they were already putting the seeds. Dalai Lama has been funded by the CIA already in the late 50s. So that started a long time ago. And as Brian mentioned just before, in the Pentagon Papers, it says clearly, we need to contain China because they already view China as the finest step. The final step for what? Because there's a project of a new world order, or there's many ways to call it, but it's just pure neo-imperialism, just rebranded with the better marketing and using freedom, human rights, and democracy, which is all fake. It's all fake. It's for a U.S. agenda, and it's to suppress the global South. With China and Russia emerging, is going to give a chance to the world to give a voice to the global South that has been oppressed for hundreds of years. And this is, if we are talking about democracy should happen at the UN level, and we should finally give a voice to the global South.
I find it very interesting that within the framework of what we are discussing, there's the element of the South China Sea dispute. It's something that the West is inserting itself. A lot of the elements that need to be considered when discussing the South China Sea is how important it is to global trade. If I'm not mistaken, there's $3.7 trillion that actually are shipped through the South China Sea. So destabilizing or disrupting this particular route for global logistics, it would be detrimental not only to China and to Southeast Asian countries, but the world itself. And the main issue is China is establishing military facilities in the South China Sea. Now, how do I see this? I see this as creating a front that is going to defend South China Sea from, well, Western countries. I don't know to what extent Southeast Asian countries actually see these facilities as there to attack or to control these countries more than for China to defend itself and the region from disruption from the West. Kind of like a NATO alliance of Southeast Asia. We have military facilities ready to be deployed and used and put into action if we are going to protect our global distribution route. What is your take, Brian, on the dispute of the South China Sea?
I think actually you made a really great point there. All of this trade going through the South China Sea, who do we think this is most important to? The United States, who, as you say, is inserting themselves into these disputes, or China, who is obviously dominating trade and to whom trade is so important. So they're not going to do something to deliberately destabilize the South China Sea. Who would do that? The US would obviously do that. It's just so plain and clear. And what the US is doing in the South China Sea is very similar to what they're trying to do in the Mekong region. The US State Department has the Mekong US partnership, and all that is the exact same thing. They're creating a crisis, and then they're inserting themselves into it as the solution. And the goal is to unite all of these Southeast Asian countries against China. So when we're looking at the disputes in the South China Sea over these different islands, if you actually study each one of these disputes, it's not just countries in Southeast Asia having these disputes with China. It's all of the countries in Southeast Asia having disputes with one another also over who actually owns these islands. And when you say dispute, we're talking about something that has been there for decades. They've been arguing about these islands for decades, and they are small disputes. They're not conflicts. They are not crises. Every once in a while, it'll get heated. But as I like to point out to people, we just watched the UK and France fight over Jersey Island. It got heated, but it didn't even become a crisis, you know? And this is the exact same thing in the South China Sea. So what the US is trying to do is insert itself and then transform ordinary disputes that can be resolved bilaterally. They're trying to turn it into a regional or international crisis. And it's exactly as you were alluding to. It's to disrupt trade in the region, and it's just another attack point the US is using against China. And think about it. They are crossing an entire ocean to insert themselves into that crisis. They could not find any allies in the region to join them in the South China Sea, so they are inviting France and the UK, who have to travel again across oceans. Germany, it's so ridiculous. And what does it look like? People who study history, it looks like Western imperialism, the age of colonialism reborn. And this is what they're doing, and they're just dressing it up as upholding the international rules-based order.
Angelo, I cannot talk about neighboring China or turmoil around China without talking about Taiwan. We're seeing the rhetoric about a China invasion of Taiwan escalating in Western media. Me personally, I don't even like to use the word invasion. It would just be a reunification. And from the 100th anniversary of the Chinese, the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping mentioned that every intention is to have a peaceful reunification with Taiwan in time. Plenty of time, plenty of patience, letting things develop in a way that when the West declines, Taiwan will look at China for partnership, for support, for trade, for help. But the provocation is there. The provocation is real. And my biggest fear is that the regular people that are watching this provocation will at one point push the government or pressure the government to respond, to retort, to reply to some kind of provocation. And that's the biggest fear that I have. I've sent a message to Chinese people in Chinese in one of my previous videos where I said, like, we got to trust the diplomacy of the Chinese government, that they will handle things in the appropriate way. So not to escalate the situation. So Angelo, how do you see this provocation in Taiwan, and what role does it play in in this discussion that we're having today?
I think we should always differentiate whenever it comes to Taiwan or all Southeast Asia, the relationship with China or the mainland when it comes to Taiwan. There's one thing is the rhetoric, or what people say, and actions. And I think we like to look at trades. When you look at the relationship of Taiwan with the mainland, 40% of Taiwan's trade goes with the mainland. So I like to say that actually Taiwan is de facto already reunited with China, with the mainland. Why? Because you have 2 million Taiwanese working in the mainland. You have 40% of trade, which is with the mainland. You have deep connections. Then what is happening right now in terms of rhetoric, in terms of talks, you have the DPP of Taiwan, which is pro-independence movement, which is completely hijacked by the US. They get the funding supports. Keep in mind that Taiwan democracy is completely hijacked because they have huge funding, foreign funding, especially from the US. The National Endowment for Democracy announced that they open an office there in Taiwan. So the problem is that you have two generations. You have the younger generations that are going with the DPP. They don't realize because you can manipulate the history, and they have a lot of kids right now. What they're doing, the same as in Hong Kong, they watch Hollywood movies and they think this is history. So the problem is that also the narratives and the media are being hijacked. Medias like Apple Daily, they did lots of destruction in the youth in Hong Kong because they brainwashed them. They brainwashed them into siding with the colonialist. But then you have the older generation that know more about their history. They knew what was Hong Kong before the handover. Well, they have a different approach. So that is the problem. You have this new generation that don't necessarily know history and the geopolitics behind this. And Taiwan is just being used as a pawn. So I want to believe that people are wiser than that. There's I don't know if you saw, there was a retired general in Taiwan that came out on TV and said, if we were to go to war with the mainland, we should not fight, and we should overthrow the DPP, which is betraying Taiwan's constitution. So I believe that if it comes to the worst, that's what should happen, because again, Taiwan's issue is it's an unfinished war, civil war, and it's China internal matter.
True. Brian, do you have any takes on the Taiwan situation, or would you like to show us something else on the screen? I see you changed the...
Yeah, well, I'm looking at, to kind of back up what Angelo was saying, if you share the screen, I will show people this process. Again, it's the Atlas of Economic Complexity. This was from 1997. So this is, where did Taiwan export to in 1997, and then imports. And you could see how significant the US role was in all of that. And if you fast forward to today, just China alone, mainland China alone, dwarfs all of this combined for imports. And then exports, it's a little bit, for imports, it's a little more balanced, but you can still see how this has changed in favor of China. So just as Angelo was saying, you have this political game that the US is really good at interfering in. When people talk about democracy, just like Angelo said, there cannot be foreign interference, because you can pour money into media and convince people to think anything. We're watching it in the United States right now, how they lie about China, everything about China. And a lot of us spend a lot of time debunking these lies, but there are large groups of people in America that if you were to say, hey, let's vote on whether China is bad or not, they would vote, yes, China is bad. And it's the same with elections in countries here in Southeast Asia, where the US is busy meddling. they get entire groups of people to vote the way the US wants. This is not self-determination, this is foreign interference. So that's why it is so important to point out the National Endowment for Democracy, how busy it is. Angelo said in Taiwan, yes, in Taiwan, in Myanmar, in Malaysia, in Thailand. So when these kids are coming out saying, I want, in Thailand, I want Thanathorn to be Prime Minister of Thailand, where are they getting that? Did they arrive at that on their own, or is this a product of foreign interference? So it's very important that people understand this and how the political game is being manipulated. But at the end of the day, this economic game is more important. Money is power. It's an old cliche, but it's so true. The fact that Taiwan depends on the mainland economically, let's say they do gain independence, what is that going to do to their economy? Can they eat democracy instead of food when their economy tanks? And the answer is no. So that's the reality. And one last thing, this is how the US looks at these countries, as disposable pawns, because they know that independence would be a disaster for Taiwan. It would benefit absolutely no one except Washington. They've done the same thing to Australia, one of their supposed allies. They have convinced them to sabotage their relationship with China, and it has cost them greatly. And they're trying to do the exact same thing all over Southeast Asia. So it's, I think it all speaks for people who start looking at it this way. The actions of the US speak for themselves, whatever rhetoric comes out of the White House.
There are two levels of reality, so to speak. There's the mainstream media that is trying to peddle certain policies, a certain change, and certain opinions to the minds of people, the youth, both abroad and in Southeast Asia. And then there's, as you were saying, money, the businesses, the factories, the investors, the people that are putting money where they see the potential. And this leads me to Xinjiang, for example. Xinjiang is a place where you're seeing actually more exports coming out regardless of the bans, regardless of the sanctions. You're seeing more investment coming in regardless of the situation, because they know that the Xinjiang is where the BRI not begins, but kind of like leaves China, is that area of the country that is pivotal to the success of the BRI, to the real development of the BRI. So all the lies that are told on social media or on mainstream media about a particular situation in China is completely disconnected when you start to follow the money, the investment, and the real exports and imports that are taking place. Something similar taking place in Hong Kong, when the government of the United States is saying like, oh, we are releasing an advisory for businesses in Hong Kong, or doing business in Hong Kong, as in don't invest in Hong Kong, don't do business in Hong Kong. We're trying to move out of Hong Kong, when the actually American Chamber of Commerce just recently doubled the floor space in Hong Kong. So you don't double floor space when business is going down, when investment is going down, or when activity is going down. So that disconnect is something that we hope our viewers, our audiences, the people that watch what we say, what we do in our different outlets, understand that they're telling you what to think, but in fact, the powers that be, these investors, the money, that's what really is telling you the reality of what's here on the ground. I would like to move on to another country that is seeing also a lot of activity, the Philippines. Not long ago, Mr. Lloyd, I think his name, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, had a meeting with Duterte and his counterpart in the Philippines. And one of the things that they did was I think they renewed or installed once more what is called the VFA, or the I forgot what it's called right now. Is the
Visiting
VFA
Forces
stands
Agreement.
for? Yes, the Visiting Forces Agreement. And I think that the Philippines is one of those countries that plays these three positions that we were talking about. Either you hedge the choice between the United States or China, or you try to balance it, or you bandwagon behind one. I think that Duterte is doing everything he can to balance it. He's welcoming Chinese investment to the extent that that is beneficial for him, but at the same time, he's welcoming the United States. Okay, we can do some more military exercises, some more military practices. But at the same time, as Angelo shared with us during preparation, they're doing things that actually go against this positive light towards China. You want to talk about that, Angelo, 1 second?
Yeah, you know that in Chinese we have a saying, they say 敬而远之, meaning you want to be close but not too close. So they are balancing this relationship with China, all in Southeast Asia. There's the reality on the ground. You have a partner which is raising, and you want to be close enough, but at the same time you're just hedging. And it's only normal. And then you have other countries which are more aggressive. But those U.S. allies, they call them allies, but we need to challenge those terms. A lot of countries are actually hostages. I give you the same simple example. When you have a country like Japan, you have 50,000 troops in Japan that are in their soil. It's still a country which is occupied. The same as in Germany. Keep in mind that those after World War II, they were occupied and they were kind of colonized. They tapped Angela Merkel phone. So the US did that, the NSA did that. So I'm asking you, is it something that you do to your friend or your ally? When it comes to India, why India is on a short leash? That's very easy. If India doesn't obey, you can be sure that overnight there would be a color revolution in India and complete chaos, because it's a completely divided country. You know, they have their problems on their own, and then the US is leveraging on India's problems. So see, many countries that are called allies are in fact not allies. They are hostages, and they're going along. You know, they manage, but I don't think they would cross the line to go to war. Not they won't. Or hopefully they've learned from history. You know that they shouldn't be used as a useful idiots of the U.S. because U.S. doesn't fight its wars. Usually, most of the time, it's all proxies. It's all proxies. The last time they really did fight a war was in Vietnam, and it cost them dearly. It was a huge humiliation, and they don't want to have people dying for them. So the worst case scenario, what they do is that they privatize war and they pay people to go to war. You know. So again, we need to redefine all this whenever it comes to allies. At the moment, it's the U.S. is very lonely. And time is in favor of China, because China, in fact, is raising peacefully, and every year the economy is stronger, and I'm confident that as long as the status quo is in place, there should be a peaceful transition, hopefully.
Brian, I wanted to explore one possibility. What do you think? One of the pieces of the puzzle that could change is, what if we have a real decoupling between China and the United States, where there's basically a cut and end the supply chain. America is going to deal with its own supply chain. China is going to have to figure out its own supply chain. How would that affect the region and the neighboring countries from your perspective?
Well, that's a good question. I think, as Angelo said, a lot of these countries are trying to balance. They want to do business with the United States. It's a huge market. There's over 300 million people there. It's a huge market. Why wouldn't people want to at least export there? If there was a complete decoupling, I think we would see the reality that China is a country that has 4 to 5 times the population of the U.S. if you look at certain metrics, their economy is already bigger than the U.S. economy. And even the metrics that say the U.S. is still ahead, those are going to change very soon. So decoupling, the U.S. decoupling from China, all this is going to do is ensure the U.S. is surpassed, and it benefits in absolutely no way from China's rise. And it would make very little sense. And we already see the U.S. Putting countries on the spot and saying, choose, and then they're choosing China. And maybe they're not doing it as directly, but again, like if you look at the Philippines, it's the exact same story where trade going to and from China dwarfs all of North America and Europe combined. It's just another one of those cases. And the US, the last cards that they have to play is this ability to interfere in their internal political affairs. The use of terrorism, especially in the Philippines, there are extremist groups that the US uses to kind of like an axe hanging over their head. I remember when the Philippines first said they were going to push the US military out, suddenly ISIS terrorists took over a city in southern Philippines, and the US said, oh, well, we were going to leave. You sure you don't want us to stay and help you? It's exactly like the local mafia, but on a geopolitical scale. This is how the US actually works. The exact same thing happened here in Thailand. Uyghur terror suspects were transiting Thailand on their way to Turkey to join Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. And the Thai government sent some of them back to China. They caught them and sent them back to China. And the US said, no, don't do that. And the US doesn't just ask nicely and you say no. And they said, okay, well, maybe next time you'll listen to us. A couple of months later, this was in 2015, there was a bombing in downtown Bangkok that killed over 20 people. It was a grisly terror attack. That is how the US does business. They come in and they say something might happen to your shop, and if you don't want to pay the protection money, and then they just knock over Iraq to kind of give you a taste of what's coming. That this is how they do business. We see examples of it all around the globe. So just to get back to your question, decoupling, I think it would just lead, the US is trying to isolate China. I think decoupling would just isolate the US.
All right. One of the reasons that triggered my interest in doing this particular show is Kamala Harris' upcoming visit to Vietnam. Where do we see Vietnam being a communist country, Vietnam being a country that is taking a lot of the manufacturing that China no longer does? Where do you see Vietnam going, and what's the reason for Kamala Harris coming to Vietnam? What do you think is the intention? What do you think is the role of Vietnam in all this moving pieces that we're seeing around China? Who would like to go first? Angelo?
Well, just imagine just the slogan she used. It's showing how much ignorance she has about the region. Calling America is back. I mean, imagine on the psyche of Vietnamese. That's the worst thing you can say, really. But Vietnamese are very pragmatic. Again, we need to look at history. If there is one country that has animosity with China, well, that's Vietnam, because for thousands of years there was aggressive. China might have been quite aggressive a long time ago. So it has thousands of years of animosity between the two countries. So and then you have recent history of Americans meddling in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. So they're just being very pragmatic. There is a lot of meddling also when it comes to National Endowment for Democracy, but they are aware of what is happening, how the game is being played. And I think that the countries in the regions, they are actually, a lot of those countries are using what happened in Hong Kong, this whole meddling and how China dealt with Hong Kong, to apply similar tactics and strategy when it comes to protecting their own sovereignty. So I think that what Vietnam will do is just being very pragmatic, just playing both sides. You don't want to cut ties with China. You need China; it's a partner. And Vietnam joined the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's if you want to see a barometer of relationship, Belt and Road Initiative is a good way to gauge, to have a good view on the
Measure.
relationship with China.
I want to ask a question for the general viewer, the person who's watching this after 45 minutes and thinking, okay, you guys keep talking about NED, you guys keep talking about color revolutions. What is that? What is a color revolution? Brian, how would you define a color revolution? And what is NED's role in creating color revolutions around Southeast Asia?
Okay, so a color revolution is just another way to accomplish regime change. So everyone should be very familiar with the United States carrying out regime change in Iraq. They just plain out lied. They invaded the country. They murdered, imprisoned, or chased out everyone in the government. At one point, they had a provisional government that was literally made up of Americans, like just white guys walking around Iraq running the country, just like in the British Empire. It was crazy. And then they've been there ever since. And we can see what has happened to Iraq. And what was the purpose of that? The purpose of that and Syria and Libya and all these other countries, the US just outright like murders the governments and replaces them. They're doing this to deny these countries to adversaries like Russia and China. And so what a color revolution is kind of like regime change light. You know, it's a softer version of just invading a country and killing the government. And they will use this either because they can't really justify a military invasion or they couldn't really pull it off. So they do this very long-term, invasive, and just constant undermining of their sovereignty. So how do they do this? They find opposition groups that could never get into power on their own. They promise them power, and they just dump millions and millions of dollars into just political parties and opposition groups, fake human rights fronts, into opposition media. And you can just go to the National Endowment for Democracy's website, regions, where we work, regions, and just pick any country, and you will see a long list. And when you look at the details of these programs, they're openly meddling in their internal political affairs. If Russia or China were doing this to the US, they would just scream foreign interference. And yet they openly do this in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, everywhere. They're doing it everywhere. And some people accuse me of saying, oh, Brian, you know, you say the US is behind everything. And often the people saying this to me are also funded by the US government. They're funded by the NED or USAID. And they're like, oh, Brian, you're paranoid. And like the last 15 years of your life, you have been funded by the US government. So what are you talking about? But it is a huge issue. And people don't understand that empire is something we're all familiar with if we read history books. Well, when was the magic moment when human nature changed and this desire for empire disappeared? And the answer is it never did. It's still here with us. It's rebranded. They use different ways to dress it up. You know, the British used to say they were exporting culture and civilization. And today we just say democracy and freedom. It's just a dressing for just apex exploitation and subjugation. That's what it is. So yes, if you see a protest, find out who the leaders are and follow the money. And if it leads to the NED, that it's foreign interference. It is not a genuine pro-democracy movement. Foreign interference, by definition, negates self-determination and democracy. So people need to keep that in mind. You cannot take foreign money and then say this is a process of self-determination. It's a contradiction.
It's one of the things that whenever you look back and you start to see where the United Nations came to be and what were some of the propositions that came out of the United Nations were the non-interference in domestic affairs. That was one of the main things that came out of the United Nations and World War II. That's why they wanted to have the United Nations to respect each country's domestic affairs and deal this common table where they could talk about these situations. But since almost the creation of the United Nations, you've seen interference of the United States in countries all over the world, in South America, in Africa, in Russia, in Asia. There's a very long list of regime change operations that used to be led by the CIA that now have been rebranded as the NED. Is it wrong to assume that NED equals CIA? Angelo?
No, absolutely. It's exactly the same thing. It's just rebranded. And again, I think there was a change in the US. They used to do it hidden, covertly, and now they do it openly with transparency through NED. But keep in mind, NED is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other institutions that are actually funding a lot those color revolution. It's a strategy where you have lots of NGOs that are joining in. You have George Soros Foundation. You have the propaganda arm, which is USAGM. Just the budget of USAGM is $1 billion US just for propaganda. So you see, it's a very complex. And you have also foreign governments. Even Germany. Germany, they do foreign interference through Bolle Stiftung. It's a foundation, and it operates very, very similarly to George Soros Foundation. And he's actually funding also the Green Party in Germany, and they are pro-NATO, they are pro-war. So imagine a Green Party, that is promoting ecology and is pro-war, and that's the reality. It's just more rebranding. Again, now NED, the new flag is an inclusive flag. So now you are going to receive bombs that are inclusive, because whoever is bombing you is LGTB or is a black person. That's the reality. It's just good branding. And Hollywood is helping. Why? Because in Hollywood you'll see a CIA agent killing many people, but because he's good looking and looks like a Brad Pitt, then it's not too bad.
Brian, I see that you changed your screen again. Would you like me to share something?
Sure. This goes back to your question about whether it's accurate or not to say the NED is doing what the CIA used to do. This is an article from the Washington Post. Innocence Abroad, the new world of spyless coups. So spyless means no longer relegated to the CIA, and coups means regime change. I think we all understand that. And then National Endowment, and it's right here. And they're talking about the apex organization that has taken over CIA-sponsored regime change is the National Endowment for Democracy. It's in black and white right here. And there's other articles like this from the New York Times. Missionaries for Democracy. Remember I was saying about old empire, and they used to export civilization and culture. And so missionaries was a huge part of empire, like European empire used the facade of religion to enslave people, really. And then this is just using democracy, and they're admitting it in the New York Times. And it's the exact same thing all throughout this article. You're going to see CIA, National Endowment for Democracy, two more. Remember the Arab Spring? Everyone was like, these are pro-democracy protests, and it admits right here a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, and they admit that they're subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's all funded by Congress. And one last one is Serbia in the late 1990s, and down here they admit that this UKPAR pro-democracy movement was actually funded millions of dollars by the U.S. government. They had secret meetings outside the country with U.S. government officials, helping them direct the overthrow of the Serbian government. And they had bank accounts outside of the country, and they do this to this day. All of these NED groups, because I confront them here in Thailand, they'll say, we're not getting the money. Okay, we're getting the money, but they don't tell us what to do. Okay, we had a meeting with them, but they weren't telling us what, like they backpedal as you expose them. And we could just look at these examples. This article here, when is this from? How far back does this go? This is 1991 right here. And a lot of these articles are from way back, 1986, 2011 for the Arab Spring, the late 1990s for Serbia. And you could say this is Russian or Chinese propaganda. No, it's the New York Times and Washington Post. So quite clear cut. The NED is an extension of the CIA. And when people say the CIA is funding you, and you say, no, they're not, because it's a technicality, because the money's passing through the NED before it gets to you. That is a technicality, and that's debating in bad faith. and extremely shady.
Well, there's one last question that I would like to ask the group, all two of you, and I will add my answer after I listen to what you gentlemen have to say. What is China to do? What is this going to result for the BRI project, for the BRI idea of uniting the world in a win-win cooperation of business and prosperity for Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and etc. What is China to do? I know it's a difficult question, but what do you reckon, Angelo?
Well, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a very smart move. In reality, look at the project. What is behind this? It's with one stone killing many birds. One of the problems of China is the Malacca Straits, and this is where the West could contain China by doing a blockade, and it could be very devastating for China. So with the Belt and Road Initiative, you bypass the Malacca Straits. With the Belt and Road Initiative, you also make it's good for the prosperities of your neighbors. You neighbors get richer. It's the area, the region become more stable, and it's going to be prosperity also for China. A third one that is actually not much mentioned is China has a trade surplus. Trade surplus is translated into very large reserve of US dollar currencies. The best way for China to recycle those US dollar currency is by investing into tangible assets. And in reality, this is an attack of the US dollar. Why? Because the US dollar is like a Ponzi scheme. The system works as long as you recycle into the US, and the US can keep on printing money. So the Belt and Road Initiative is contributing also into the de-dollarization, because a lot of those trades are actually and transactions are not being done in US dollar. So you see, China is doing right, and I think the time is in favor of China. Why? Because it's delivering to its people. It's showing the world that it's bringing prosperity to its people. And what might happen is that the US will have at some point to face some contradictions, because they're telling the world that through lots of brainwashing in Hollywood that it's the best model, but in reality, well, you know, look at the satisfactions of Americans. So I think that maybe China is thinking, well, the system, the USA, the system might collapse before we go into a hot war. But again, you know, I mean, nobody can tell. I mean, just how can we just hope for the best. And I think all what we are doing by coming out in YouTubes and telling people, trying to tell people about all this meddling, is just somehow fighting against Cold War, or at worst, a hot war. So we just have to hope for the best again. Yeah.
Good. Brian, what are your thoughts on what is China to do, and what is the BRI to do? How to continue facing what is facing right now?
So I think Angelo was making a good point there. China is first of all setting an example at home. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, what they're doing is the opposite of colonialism. They're building up nations. When you build tangible infrastructure inside of a country, you're making it more self-reliant. And then what is being facilitated here between nations is not subjugation, it is trade. It's just trade, it's just doing business. So this is really important, but as you can see, the US is undermining it. We were just talking about color revolution. So what can China do about this to protect their allies and to protect their Belt and Road Initiative? And I think we have some good examples of what China has done in Hong Kong with the national security law, and what they've done to uproot extremism in Xinjiang by giving people prospects and pushing development and connecting people that are kind of on the outskirts because they are just physically removed by geography from the rest of society, connecting them, and then everyone can move forward together. So China exports a lot of actual weapons like tanks and jets and missiles. What else can they export to help nations defend themselves? Because warfare is not just fought on air, land, and sea. There's now information space. So what I would suggest, what I would love to see is China helping other nations set up their own social media networks, their own English language news services, so that there could be a greater balance of power. Here in Thailand, information space, if you look at it like air, land, and sea, and then information, Thailand's information space is utterly dominated by US-based social media companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google. The Thai government is helpless when they are mobilizing these platforms against the Thai government. The Thai government has absolutely no way to stop them. If China were able to help, let's say, Thailand set up their own social media, they could rebalance this equation in favor of Thailand's sovereignty in their own information space. So this is one of many examples of what China could probably do, rethink their export, rethink social media and media as a form of export, like a defense product, basically.
That is an amazing point that you bring up, because there's a reason why a lot of social media in the West is not available in China, is to have some control over the security risks that it could present when information is manipulated outside of China. Now, for me, from my perspective, I think that what China needs to do is continue to build its block of cooperation with big countries such as Iran, such as Russia. Angelo, you were mentioning something extremely important. Russia recently has announced that they are going to start accepting transactions in renminbi. That's important. They're already doing oil transactions with Iran, probably using digital currency from China. And this is starting to take place little by little, simultaneously as the United States is incurring into more and more debt, is facing more and more inflation. They just released a new package for infrastructure that is going to require them to print more money that is not supported in any way, shape, or form, other than the fact that oil transactions have to be done in dollars, and that's what gives the strength to the US dollar. But as they start to, for example, be unable to pay the interest on their debt, and they start defaulting on their debt, that is going to be the decisive moment for China and its currency and its business ventures to solidify. So for me, I think that what China needs to do is be patient and watch America mess it up on their own. All right. Gentlemen, I would like to do one last round, and then we can end our video. So any last thoughts, Angelo, then Brian?
We mentioned the dollar just before. I think the dollar issue is the ultimate goal. I think where it hurts the most is going to be the dollar. You mentioned money printing. The debt used to be financed by issuing of bonds. Even allies such as Japan and Germany are not buying any more US bonds. They're not increasing. So all the debt is actually into money printing, and money printing doesn't work. If the US dollar was not a global currency, well, they would print money. It would translate into extremely high inflation. Once the dollar is not the global currency, then that's for sure the collapse of the US economy. So the question is that will China will let it collapse, or will it rescue the US like it did in 2008? And I think China will have to manage somehow this some kind of a bailout or soft landing of the US. I think.
It's also important for the world economy to not let it fall completely. Although I think that China did learn their lesson from 2008. Brian, your final thoughts.
I think people need to just be aware that this is a thing. The US is desperately trying to contain China, and they're not doing it by just targeting China directly, which we all see and understand, but they're doing it indirectly by attacking all of their Belt and Road partners. And so people, when they're looking at Thailand, a lot of people are tempted to say, oh, I'm leftist, and it has a constitutional monarchy, and the prime minister is a former general, so obviously he's right wing, so I'm against him. You got to zoom out, and you have to look at the entire game board. This is what the U.S. Banks on, people making these mistakes and looking at things ideologically instead of geopolitically. If you look at it geopolitically and just follow the money, it is very, very simple to sort out. And the more people know this, the harder it's going to be, because the reason they created the National Endowment for Democracy in the first place was to rebrand what the CIA was doing, because people were catching on to what the CIA was doing. Now they're catching on to what the NED is doing. They're going to just continue trying to push this until everybody wakes up and there's no more shadows for them to hide in. Then they're going to be forced to just do business like everybody else. And this is, when I talk about, say, Thailand defending itself against the US, it's not about making an enemy out of the US. It means taking all the options off the table where the US can interfere and bully Thailand, and only leave the option of constructive engagement on the table, just doing business. And that will not just benefit the people in Thailand and Southeast Asia and all of Asia, but it'll also benefit America. Like, most Americans are not into interfering abroad, or if they are, it's born out of a misconception created by propaganda. So again, like, China is setting this good example of just doing business and then otherwise minding its own business. And if we could help encourage people to get on board with this mentality rather than this side versus that, left versus right, I think we will all benefit.
Good. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you very, very much. It has been a pleasure and an honor to have you here in the WuMao Show. It's a very, very good learning experience for me and for the people watching. We learned a lot from you, gentlemen, so I want to thank you very much for your participation. And, well, I want to invite you all to go visit their social media. We'll have the links in the description down below so that you can follow Angelo and Brian. And, well, if you have any other questions or any comments or anything that you would like us to discuss at a later episode, make sure to leave it in the comment section down below. And, well, until we see you again, that's it for now. Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye-bye.